I had a friend who I was talking on another podcast, and I love the way he phrased it. He said, "They own the problem, but you own the solution."
Welcome to the podcast about communication in business. I'm your host, George Torok. Did you know that I'm known as the speech coach for executives? That's because I help business leaders deliver the intended message for greater success. And we do that through one-on-one coaching or group training for the team. On this podcast, you will hear from communication experts from around the world with their advice and insights to help you deliver your intended message. My guest today is Bill Shander. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about my guest. Bill has been teaching data storytelling and visualization for about 10 years for clients around the world and on LinkedIn Learning. 2, he just wrote and published his first book, Stakeholder Whispering, Uncover What People Need Before Doing What They Ask. Now that we're going to probe into. And 3, he has been playing ice hockey for 50 years, and he's getting better every year, or at least that's what he believes. And Bill, I applaud you for staying with hockey for 50 years because that is tough on the body. I'm guessing you're not doing a full check-in anymore.
Oh my goodness, no. I could not even come close to it. I've been doing full body checking since I was about 20, thank goodness.
Well, good for you for sticking with it. Bill, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Thank you very much for having me, George. I'm really happy to be here.
Delighted to explore this conversation today, especially the concept of stakeholder whispering. Now, typically, when we think about a whispering, I think of the term the horse whisperer. That was a movie, I think, at one time. And it was about someone who could connect immediately with the horses by whispering in their ear, and they would know what he meant. What are you talking about when you talk about stakeholder whispering?
So the basic idea is this, and I love the name of the podcast, Your Intended Message, because that implies that you know what your intended message is and what you're trying to get across, which is the first step. And we sort of take that as a given. The premise of the book is that, first of all, stakeholders often don't know what their intended message really should be and why and what their audience actually needs from them. And so it's figuring that out. And the whispering part is when we're working with our stakeholders, helping them do whatever they're doing, we have to sort of work with them like a horse whisperer, sort of whisper in their ear and really figure out with them in a collaborative way what they really should be doing and why. So it's that it is that communications aspect of how we work with our stakeholders to help them figure out what they need so that we can deliver against that.
And you're right. I run into people often who don't seem to know what their intended message is, what they're actually trying to say. And I'm sitting there thinking, so what's your point? What's your point? Where is this going? And they don't know. What have you discovered? Why does that happen? Why do people start yapping before they know what they want to get across?
I think a big part of it is that we work in, essentially an automated way. So like the simplest example is, I used to do web design and development many years ago. And I'd be designing a website and someone would come along and say, make the logo bigger, make the button blue. And, logo bigger, I get. It's like, okay, well, you want your brand to stand out more, fine. But why should the button be blue? Well, because I just want people to notice it and to click on it. Okay, so that's what you really need is you want people to click on the button more. And so blue may or may not be the right answer, but that's what you're really asking me for. And so we just work in an automated way. Like we're launching a new product, make a brochure, new product brochure. And so maybe a brochure is what you need, but what you really need is a way to communicate the features and benefits of your product. Okay, let's focus on that need. Then we can decide if a brochure is the right response. So it's that automated response. It's like, this is what we always do. This is how we always do it. So therefore, they just go right there.
And I suppose that people think when they say make the button blue, they're saving time because they're telling you that they want a blue button because in their mind, they've already figured out that in order for it to stand out and so people click, it has to be blue. They've already decided that. And so they figure they're saving you time instead of saying to you, Bill, I want people to click on that button. What do we need to do to make it clickable, more clickable? And it's not necessarily change the color or make it bigger. Maybe it should be in a different place. Maybe the lead up phrase to the button should say something different.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And, I had a friend who I was talking on another podcast, and I love the way he phrased it. He said, they own the problem, but you own the solution. Mm-hmm. And so they know they need the button to be clicked, but you as the designer in this particular case are the ones who should help guide the actual solution. And yes, they're just trying to save you time. They have an idea and they want to contribute to the creative process. Nothing wrong with that. But, it is the designer's job to really make sure that they're delivering the best solution for that particular problem. So it's not that our stakeholders are necessarily wrong or that they're always out of touch with what they need, but they sometimes are. And our job is to help make sure that we're delivering against the real underlying need, not necessarily against the request that they've started with.
So how do you discover the real need?
Well, let me ask you, George. So you said that you've had this experience where you're working with somebody and, you're like, well, get to the point. What are you really trying to say? How have you done in the past? Let me, if it's okay, if I can start with asking you the same question.
And that's a fair question. And one technique is to repeat what they said in a questionable way. You want the button to be blue and then wait, to see what they say. So that one that's telling them that I heard what they said, and the other time I heard what they said, but I'm not sure I understand what's behind it. Now, if there's still no reply, then I might say, why do you want it to be blue?
Yeah, that's a good technique. And it's funny because, when you repeat back what somebody said, as you said, first of all, they feel heard. And second of all, oftentimes we repeat it back, but we'll sort of translate the words a little bit. So we'll sort of re-say it in a slightly different wording. And what that does is A, they feel heard, and B, you're demonstrating that you understand, which is essentially demonstrating empathy. And it's actually triggering your own empathy to really feel what they're feeling to some degree. Empathy is a learnable thing, and it's a really important part of the process. And the other key thing about that is we also start to ask the questions. Like you said, tell me why you think blue would be the right choice. And the asking questions is one of the most important techniques. And, as I describe in the book, you want to use the Socratic method. And the Socratic method, most of us remember, means asking questions. Okay, good. But what most of us forget or never even learned about the Socratic method is that it's not asking questions in order to get the answer so that we can learn. That's part of it. But the Socratic method is actually, I ask you questions in order for you to learn. When you're stakeholder whispering, you're not just learning yourself, a one-way street coming back to you. It's a two-way process. When I ask you questions, you're going to learn from me as well. And so essentially, I see my job when I'm doing stakeholder whispering is I'm helping to guide my stakeholders to discover for themselves what they actually need. It's like therapy. I'm helping them dig deep into their own subconscious to figure out what they're really trying to do. Because then together, we'll figure out the best way to do it.
And Bill, I'm thinking of a conversation I had recently. Well, I was talking with a marketer and they said they do masterclass. They do masterclasses. And I said, what do you mean by do? And what do you mean masterclass? And so it turns out that he was talking about that they would produce a webinar. Oh, now I get it. Because when you say do, I don't know what that means, do. That's something that's on the lawn in the morning.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a really good point. And it's something I talk about in the book also, is that most of this is a job of constant translation. It is. It's constantly saying, okay, you said do. What do you really mean by that? When you said masterclass, what do you really mean by that? Because, you have to sort of get down to the basics. We use jargon and, different words that mean different things. And let's really dig into that. And it also brings up a second technique that I talk about, which is something I call chunky segmentation. And the basic idea of chunky segmentation is exactly what you just described. So they said literally, I do master classes. Okay. Chunking is a very well cited piece of psychology research, which essentially says humans can understand one idea at a time. And if you break it into chunks, it's easier to wrap our heads around. And so the technique of chunky segmentation is literally digging into each little bit of information in whatever the conversation is. So literally, I know you mean you by that. So we don't have to dig into that one. I don't think, although actually, maybe we should dig into that. When you say I do master classes, do you mean you, George? Or do you mean you, your company? Do you mean you in some broader sense or narrower sense? Like, what do you really mean by I even? Do, like you said, what do you really mean by do? I produce, I host, I whatever these things. What do you really mean by master class? And so you sort of can dig in pretty deep. You can ask like 30 questions potentially on each one of those little chunks of information to really suss out the details.
And what happened, Bill? How do we deal with people who get annoyed by us asking those questions? Because some people say, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a hard one. And, people who get annoyed, people who don't have the time to answer all the questions, people who, maybe they get frustrated or, they think they've answered it. They can't really re-articulate it. There are all kinds of issues. I have a chapter in the book where I talk about the kinds of trouble you're going to run into trying to whisper with stakeholders and some of the techniques you can try to employ. But I have to start by saying some people aren't very whisperable. Some people, listen, I'm the busy, smart CEO. I know everything. Just shut up and do what I asked, right? And, if you're a boss, your stakeholders are like that, sometimes you're not going to be able to get around it. But we also do know from a lot of research about influence and persuasion, there are techniques you can use to get to these people. And one of the biggest techniques you can employ is expertise. So, I'm older. I have what little hair I have left is white. I've been doing this for a long time. So when I walk into a room, people kind of trust me and they'll tolerate long list of questions. If you're, 26 years old and sort of junior in your career, it's going to be harder. But, you don't carry your own gravitas and expertise necessarily, but what you can do is you can cite others. So let's say you're a 26-year-old, let's go back to the example of a designer, and your client says, make the button blue. You can say, oh, that's a really interesting idea. Tell me more about why you think blue is going to be the right choice. And by the way, there's been some research that has shown that blue is very calming, but from e-commerce research, we actually know that pink buttons drive more clicks. What do you think we try pink? So if you can cite research, expertise to back up the conversation, then people are more likely to listen to you. But asking a bunch of questions, you have to be very careful. To your point, George, I'm going to ask questions, but I'm going to be also consciously aware of how this person is responding and try to be respectful of their time and energy and all the rest of it.
And Bill, what do you suggest that people might say that makes the other person more willing to answer the questions?
I think that it's probably one of the most important things is a tone and an approach of collaboration. I genuinely am curious about my clients, and I genuinely want to help them. So when I'm asking these questions, I'm like, well, why do you think you want a blue? That's a crazy idea. I'm not coming at it with like that. I'm more like, oh, interesting, blue. Yeah, blue's in your brand palette. Maybe we should try blue. But, every other time we've used blue, it's meant to represent this, not that. So maybe, what about the tertiary palette in your design brand? Like maybe we should try the greens because of da, 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 da. So it's always more of a, I'm here to help you approach. And so I very rarely get pushback, even when I was younger. I think it's a tone thing as much as anything else.
And I noticed what could be a valuable phrase there that you just said, and I wrote it down. So one could say, I'm curious and I want to help. So please tell me more about.
Yeah, that's it. It's funny. The phrase that I've been using is, you're going to use the Socratic method. You're asking questions. And in the end, all of those questions come back to why. Why do you want the button to be blue? Why? Why is a hostile question, right? I want a blue button. Why? You can't just say why. Like that's truly comes across kind of obnoxiously. But if you are curious and you genuinely want to help, then it just doesn't come across that way. So curiosity is a key part of it, and that collaborative approach is really important.
And Bill, I think it's worth reinforcing what you just said, that why is often perceived as a hostile question. And that could be confusing for some people because, Simon Sinek told us we should always start with why, which is true, but we can't keep grilling people on why. So how do we find out why without saying the word?
Yeah. I mean, it's literally what we talked about before. It's always a constant translation game. I know I want to get to why. What's another way of saying why? You said it before, George. You said, tell me more about what you think. Tell me more about, why, what about blue do you think will be effective here? So there are different ways of saying it. And the other part of it is this, you can ask questions that mean different things with different phrasing all the time. So for instance, one of the techniques I talked about in the book I call the dance of the 6 W's. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And how is like an honorary W word. I might ask questions like, when is this due? It's due next Thursday. That's easy. Tell me about who's going to use this. Well, the HR department is going to use this report that I'm making. Okay. And when are they going to use it? Well, they're going to use it before they do recruiting next spring. Okay. And, tell me more about that recruiting process. Who are they talking to? Da, 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 da. Essentially, I'm dancing around all these different words, and I'm dancing in between divergent questions that make the conversation open up, very broad, like questions like why, and convergent questions like when next Thursday. It's very easy. And it's the back and forth between the divergent and convergent questions that sort of puts people into sort of fluctuating frames of mind. And as you're doing that, you're circling around that underlying why, which you can't ask directly sometimes. But also you end up asking questions like, even the when question. When are we going to do it? Well, it's going to be for next spring's recruiting season. That's also simultaneously a who question, because it implies, it's when we're recruiting next spring college graduates. So it's for college graduates or audience again. So I just answered a who again. And so sometimes you're answering a different question than you asked to get to your original point, George. You ask why by asking, tell me more. You ask who by saying when. And so it's this constant keeping the mind flexible and moving in different directions that'll eventually get your stakeholder to say, oh, wait, yeah, hold on. It's all about the college graduates. That's the real point of what I'm doing right now. I just answered a who and you didn't even ask me who. And then suddenly they'll say, I never thought about it that way. Yes, I'm seeing something I didn't think about before. And that's like that aha moment when you realize you're about to make a breakthrough to the true underlying need that you're trying to get to.
And Bill, it seems to me that when you're asking those questions, it's like you're trying to roll a video inside your head to see the situation. And so it's cloudy at first, and you're trying to add pieces of the video in your head as you ask these questions and fill in the blanks. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say. And what's interesting is you said it's cloudy at first, which I think is true. Although interestingly, the stakeholder doesn't think it's cloudy at all. They think they need a blue button, or they think they need that HR report. They don't think it's cloudy. You realize that it probably is cloudy. And the Socratic method, what Socrates said, the goal of the Socratic method was to push the respondent, the person they're asking questions of, into a state of aporia. Aporia is a Greek word, and it means a state of puzzlement. So in other words, the goal of the Socratic method is to make it a little bit cloudy. It's actually to add a little bit of, wait, hold on. Wait a second. I never really thought about that way before. You're sort of creating a moment of slight disruption from which they can emerge with the actual insight. So you're pushing them into the clouds a little bit as part of the process. You're not deliberately trying to confuse anybody, but you're trying to get them to think from a new perspective and see things in a new way.
And so when you are able to push them into that state of puzzlement or cloudiness that allows them to say, oh, exactly that. Oh, I never thought of it that way. Oh, I see what it could mean. Let me help clarify that.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
They're going through that self-learning process.
100%. It's like therapy, and therapists, cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the key parts of the process is the Socratic method. So George, let's say you come into therapy and you say, you're talking about some trauma you had as a child. The therapist doesn't say, oh, go do 10 push-ups and, write in your journal for an hour. What they say is, oh, tell me more. How did that make you feel? And as you talk more and more and more and answer their questions, eventually you get to some insight about how that makes you who you are today. So you're discovering for yourself what's going on in your life. And that's what this process really is. That you're guiding them to self-discovery, just to fill in that movie in their own heads.
How important are the visuals?
So, this process that I'm describing isn't part of what I normally teach, the data storytelling and visualization, but it's directly tied to it in that when people come to me for data storytelling and visualization work, they say, the example in data visualization is perfect. It's like, okay, hey, we have data, give me a dashboard and put a pie chart over here and put a bar chart over there. That's just the automated response again. That's just what we think of when we think of data, put it into a bar chart. But the visual representation of data or anything else is highly nuanced. What's the right visual? In fact, this is an exercise I do in my workshops. I say, you have 2 seconds, draw money, go. And people will always draw a dollar sign. Like 99% of the time, it's a dollar sign or maybe a dollar bill. But if I give them 60 seconds to draw money, they'll come up with all kinds of creative ideas. Credit card, wallet, stock chart, bread, cheese, all these different metaphors for money. So the obvious first response isn't always the best response to visualize something or to communicate an idea or anything else. And so your intended message, right? Like, what are you trying to do when you're drawing money? Well, if it's to indicate a button that I should click to pay for something, it probably should be something obvious like a dollar sign. If it's a more nuanced idea, then you want a more nuanced visual. So, it's a very similar idea, getting past the automated response, but they're sort of two separate ideas. In the book, by the way, I have a bunch of little illustrations to sort of reinforce key ideas throughout, because I think the power of the visual mind is so powerful, but they are sort of two separate concepts that go hand in hand with each other.
Let's explore that visualization concept. How do we plant or paint the right pictures in our listeners' mind?
It's also a job of translation primarily. So one of my courses on LinkedIn Learning is on concept visualization. How do you create abstract conceptual images? And it's really a translation job. So again, let's say you're doing a PowerPoint slide and you want to depict money. Okay, money, dollar sign, done, easy. Let me move on with my life. Well, wait, what about money? Tell me more. There's that phrase again. Tell me more about what you really are trying to depict. Well, it's really about trade flows between countries. Okay, so it's not really money, it's trade. Okay, so maybe we should show some visual that depicts trade. Oh, and by the way, it's not just even trade. It's the fact that one of the trading partners is more dominant than the other. It's like, U.S. compared to some, tiny little country, and it's like the tariff wars. Okay, how are we going to visualize that? Oh, it's a dominant trading partner and a smaller trade. Okay, so it's more about an imbalance. So you're really trying to riff through, again, that underlying your intended message. What is it really about? And eventually you home in on such a narrow, focused, nuanced idea. That's what you make your visual about. And by the way, once you figure that out, even if you're not an illustrator, then you use those search terms in your stock image library or AI or whatever you're using to get your images together. But you use the nuanced terms, not the broad, obvious term.
So it sounds like when we want to create a visualization, we need to get past the idea that the first idea is the best one.
100%. Yeah. And sometimes, you can spend a half an hour or 3 hours and you circle back and it turns out your first idea was the best one. But always probe that, because, the first idea often is not it. The first idea is usually that automated response again.
How have you found AI to help produce those visual tools of visual images?
I think AI is a really good tool in that, you can put in your prompt, whatever it is, and it's going to generate something that you can react to. And then you can ask more nuanced questions and react and react and react. And so, let's put it this way. AI feels a lot more productive in some ways than searching stock image libraries used to be, because it was just impossible to find the perfect image in a stock image library. But I find actually that the combination of the two is probably the best. So I can search a stock image library, I find something pretty close, and then I can go to AI and say, okay, make this, and then tweak it these three ways. AI is a good tool for idea generation if you have a good idea of what you're trying to accomplish. And, again, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't know what your intended message is, then it's not going to be very helpful. So you really have to start there always.
And I did have a positive experience recently with asking AI to create an image, and I was writing a presentation tip about the importance of if you're speaking to an audience, to focus on one person at a time. And so my comments was about talk to one person at a time. And so I asked the AI to create one person sitting in an audience surrounded by empty chairs. And it did. It did it. Got it right away. Well, took time to render it, but okay, you got it. I know.
That's great.
Got this one right.
Was it an illustration or was it more photographic? Like how?
It was
how
photographic. It was photographic.
Okay.
Looked closely lifelike. It wasn't perfect, but the image was right. One person sitting in and empty chairs all around them, just reinforcing the message.
And that's a really good example where you knew exactly what you needed, and that does illustrate the idea really well. And if you said, hey, I'm trying to communicate the idea of speaking to one person at a time, I'd be very curious to see what it came up with in the absence of that well-defined prompt.
And yes, I've found that when I go in and I'm not sure of what I want, I tell the AI, here's what I'm trying to do. Give me some ideas. I usually get back. The first ones are not what I want. So at least say, okay, no, that's not what I want. I want something different. So it's a start anyways. It's not necessarily the end, but it's a start. And perhaps the AI is playing Socrates with me.
It could be. And actually, it brings up an interesting point, which I have not experimented with. But as we're talking about it seems like a good idea to try. Maybe the next time, instead of going to the image generator when your idea isn't as well formed, go to the chat AI, and say, hey, describe an image that you think would solve this problem, because it's faster, right? And then maybe there would be a Socratic process. And then once it helps you get to the best nuanced idea, then go back to the image generator where it takes a little longer.
Oh, that's an idea. Yes, you're right.
That might work.
Yes, that would be much faster. And now I'm also thinking, what about, can we actually go into AI and say, okay, play Socrates with me and take me through this process by asking me Socratic questions to move me forward?
Yeah, I think it could. I mean, they say there was an article recently about how some people are using AI as therapists. And I assume as part of that process, it's asking questions, although I'm not sure. But I bet if you asked AI to do that, it would. One of the things I say, I'm developing a keynote speech around this idea of stakeholder whispering in the book. And one of the moments in the speech, I have a slide that says, listen, AI is an argument for why we need to be better at whispering. Because, you can just ask AI to do something and it'll execute on it like a good worker should. But if we're supposed to push back a little bit and make sure our stakeholders are really asking for the right things, that's something that we can do that AI is less likely to do well today. I think tomorrow or a month from now, that may no longer be true. But I think that humans are better currently at asking unexpected follow-up questions. The kinds of follow-up questions that might make someone go, whoa, wait, hold on. Yeah, I never thought about it that way. And that may not be true. Or certainly may not be true for long. So that would be something good to test. I think your idea is right, George.
And Bill, do you suggest that we practice on ourselves by asking ourselves questions about our motivation and our messaging so that we become more comfortable and then more ready to ask someone else?
Always. And not just to prepare for working with others, but essentially you should constantly be questioning everything you do. The fact is, we know from psychological research that we are driven by our subconscious pretty much at all times. We're not actually, humans aren't very good at reasoning or really thinking things through. And so if everything is being driven by my own subconscious, like I'm designing something, making a visual, whatever it is, I'm making big blue buttons because that's my first thought. I should probably question that just like I would question it with a client. So yes, do it for your own work and do it in order to help you get better at doing it with stakeholders.
And Bill, for people who are interested in your book, and you can find that link to the book on Amazon in the description below, who is that book best for? Who will get the most of it? What will they get?
What I've been saying is that it's really for all knowledge workers, honestly. I don't care. Obviously, like designers, it's an easy example, and designers mostly know that people ask for blue buttons, but they want more clickable buttons. But you're in HR, you're in IT, you're in finance. I don't care what you do. Any knowledge worker, you have stakeholders asking you to execute on tasks, and you should be really figuring out what those tasks should be. So it's truly for anybody. But certainly in the category of like knowledge workers, people who are working on computers, reports with data or otherwise, and sort of generating knowledge content for their stakeholders.
And Bill, as we prepare to wrap up, assume that you could sit down with a team leader and whisper in their ear 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice that would help them build better communication among their team.
One thing would be hire stakeholder whisperers. Hire people who will push back against you and your colleagues and everybody else, because you want a team that is adaptive and creative and trying to do the best for the organization, not just simply doing what they're told. You don't want order takers around you. 2 is to realize that you, leader, are a stakeholder in one moment. You're asking your people to do stuff for you. And the next moment, you're reporting to your bosses. You're also, sort of need to become a stakeholder whisperer. So push back yourself, sort of play that same role. And number 3, I think that one of the most important things is what we just talked about a moment ago, which is that we all have to acknowledge that our stakeholders often don't, 99% of the time, honestly, don't know what they really need. They may think they do, and they may be sometimes right, but you have to assume that the initial request is slightly off, not because of some specific flaw to your stakeholders, but because it's just the human condition. We're driven by our subconscious. So probe everything, push back against everything, discover the true underlying need. And by the way, the reason to do this is that, we waste insane amounts of time and budget and effort and heartache on the wrong tasks. We could just save all of that if we simply discover the real underlying need first before we jump in and start doing the work.
Terrific advice. My guest today is Bill Shander, reminding you to think and say more often, I'm curious and I want to help. Tell me more about that.
I love it. George, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you like what you heard, tell your friends and post your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because that helps more listeners find us. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.